Bill thought he was walking into another debate he could dominate, until Jasmine slid a piece of paper across the table. That flipped the entire conversation and the country on its head. The green room at CBS Television City looked like it had been cleaned too many times. Not dirty, not sterile, just over-sanitized, like no one was allowed to leave a mark. The couch cushions didn't sag. The water bottles sat untouched, and the lighting hummed with that specific kind of brightness that makes everything feel just a little too exposed. Jasmine Crockett sat quietly near the far end of the room, blazer crisp, hands folded, eyes scanning. Not the room, but the moment. She had arrived 10 minutes early, on purpose. She always did. It wasn't about being prepared, it was about presence. There's something about walking into a space before anyone expects you that changes the air. But tonight, it didn't change much. No one offered her coffee. No one said, "Welcome, Congresswoman." Not even a polite brush past from a producer. It was the kind of quiet that didn't invite peace. It hinted at preparation, just not hers. Her phone buzzed once in her palm, a message from her comms director, Lena. "They're calling it a conversation. You know what that means. They're baiting you. Just stay grounded." Jasmine didn't reply. She'd already decided. No sparring, no sound bites, no emotional optics for them to spin into gifs. She wasn't here for that. And yet, she could feel it. The temperature in the room wasn't cold, it was calculated. A low murmur trickled in from the hallway. Laughter, footsteps, someone rustling papers. The energy outside the door didn't match the stillness in the room. It never did. Someone cracked a joke. The laughter died when Jasmine stood up to stretch. She didn't take it personally, she just noticed. Her assistant peeked in, young, sharp, already nervous. "They're ready for you." Jasmine nodded once, adjusted her sleeves. No mirror check, no final breath. She didn't need armor tonight. She needed clarity. As she followed the hallway toward the set, she passed a series of framed portraits, white men in suits, familiar grins, eyes full of certainty. The kind of men who'd never had to practice sounding calm to avoid being called loud. The kind who'd never been told their tone was the story. Jasmine didn't flinch. She just kept walking. Bill Maher's voice had that signature smirk baked into it, the kind that stretched a smile across syllables that weren't jokes. "Joining us tonight is someone who's got all the passion in the world," he said, eyes already trained on Jasmine before her name was even spoken. "She's young, she's rising, and if she can get past the noise, maybe she'll actually get something done." The audience gave that half laugh, the kind that wasn't about humor. It was about permission. Permission to lean into discomfort as long as it came with a punchline. Jasmine sat still, back straight, face soft. She turned toward Maher and offered the kind of smile that wasn't for him. It was for control. "Good to be here," she said. Maher grinned, like he'd been waiting for her to say anything, just so he could interrupt. "Let's start simple," he said. "Why is it that so many people on your side of the aisle seem more interested in moral victory than measurable progress?" Jasmine didn't answer right away. That wasn't hesitation. That was calculation. She tilted her head just slightly, like she was studying not the question, but the intention behind it. The audience leaned in. They could feel it too. Behind the camera, producers shifted. One whispered into a headset. Someone else adjusted a cue card. Maher leaned back in his seat like he had just placed the first chess piece. But Jasmine knew this game. It wasn't new, just televised. "This is just a conversation," Maher said, palms open in that faux casual way that always meant the opposite. "Nothing personal, just trying to cut through the fluff." Jasmine nodded. "Sure," she said. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Let's do that." The crowd gave a polite chuckle, but something shifted in the room. They weren't sure what yet, but they felt it. Maher moved to the next question quickly, like he was trying to stay ahead of a rhythm he didn't fully understand. The segment wasn't even 5 minutes in, and already the rules had changed. Because Jasmine didn't come to play defense, she came with receipts, and Bill Maher just hadn't seen them yet. Maher shifted in his seat and glanced at the cards on his lap, even though he already knew the line he was about to drop. It wasn't a question, it was a framing device, thinly veiled as dialogue. He began, leaning in slightly. I keep hearing that this generation of progressives, your generation, is more about feelings than facts, like governing has turned into group therapy. Is that what we're doing now? Making decisions based on who cries loudest? A few people in the crowd chuckled, not because it was funny, but because they weren't sure if they were supposed to laugh or just nod along. Maher smiled, not wide, not warm, sharp. He was watching her, waiting. Jasmine didn't blink. She stayed exactly where she was, hands resting gently on her lap. No shifting, no visible inhale. She let the question sit there, not in defiance, in control. Then she answered. I think what you're calling emotion, she said slowly, is just care. Another pause, not dramatic, but intentional. And maybe it feels loud to people who aren't used to seeing that in power. Maher raised an eyebrow, but Jasmine kept going. It's not about who cries loudest, she said. It's about who's been ignored the longest. So when we finally speak up, yeah, it might sound different, doesn't make it unstable, makes it overdue. The audience quieted. Someone exhaled a little too loudly. A camera panned closer. The silence wasn't dead air. It was weight. Jasmine hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't rushed. And somehow, that made her sound louder than anyone else had all night. Maher tried to pivot, but there was a flicker, just a beat, where his eyes narrowed, just slightly. Like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the one steering anymore. He tapped the armrest once. But don't you think too much emotion makes it harder to govern? I mean, yelling doesn't pass legislation. Jasmine smiled, just barely. No, she said, voice steady. But neither does pretending you don't feel anything. There wasn't a standing ovation, not yet. But something shifted. The energy in the room had been skeptical, edgy even. But now, heads tilted, eyes narrowed, not in disapproval but in focus. You could feel it. The audience wasn't watching a debate anymore. They were watching a shift, a reckoning of tone. And it had just begun. Maher straightened in his chair. His smirk flickered back on like a defense mechanism. So, are you saying there's no room for criticism? That we can't talk about tone without being accused of something? Jasmine didn't flinch. We can talk about tone, she said. We just have to be honest about whose tone we're talking about, and why. She turned slightly, addressing the room without raising her volume. Because when someone else speaks with passion, we call it strong. When I do, it's emotional. When they interrupt, it's assertive. When I respond, it's aggressive. The crowd murmured now, louder. Agreement spread like a ripple, quiet but impossible to ignore. A woman in the second row nodded, arms crossed tight, but her expression said everything. She'd heard this script before, too many times. Maher chuckled, but it was hollow. Okay, he said, but don't you think sometimes the left gets caught up in this stuff? All the identity politics, the virtue signaling? It starts to feel less like leadership and more like performance. Jasmine leaned forward just a hair, not to confront, but to anchor. Funny, she said, eyes steady, how passion's a virtue until it comes from someone like me. That line cracked something open. It wasn't a roar. It was that deep, low murmur of recognition, the kind that builds in the chest before it ever leaves the mouth. A soft came from the back row. Someone else nodded too hard, like they'd been waiting for someone to say it out loud. The camera didn't cut away this time. It held, stayed on Jasmine's face, while Maher's smirk pulled tight at the edges. This wasn't a debate anymore. This was a correction, and the crowd wasn't just watching. They were choosing. Bill Maher had been shifting in his chair for the last two questions, subtle at first, then more obvious. His smirk had calcified, stuck somewhere between amused and irritated. He wasn't losing the argument, at least not in the traditional sense. He was losing something else. Control. The kind of control that came from being the one who shaped the narrative, from knowing the audience would laugh when you landed a line, or nod when you pivoted with clever cynicism. But the nods were slowing. The laughter was turning inward, and Jasmine hadn't even raised her voice. Maher glanced at his notes, but it wasn't to read them. It was to buy time. So, he said, tone sharper now, you talk about how hard it is to be heard, to be respected. But isn't part of leadership, he paused just long enough for the moment to twist, not playing the victim every time someone disagrees with you? The words landed like a slap, not because they were loud, not because they were clever, but because they carried that familiar edge, the one that says you don't get to call this what it is. The room stilled. A few people stirred in their seats, unsure if they should clap, cringe, or wait. A slow exhale moved through the space. Not relief, recognition. They'd heard that line before. Maybe not on TV, maybe in a boardroom, or across a dinner table, or in a classroom where a girl with a steady voice got told to relax. But Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't lean forward. She didn't lean back. She just looked at him, not like an opponent, not like a caricature, like a man who had just asked a question he thought had an answer. And then she turned, slightly, toward the audience, not to perform, to invite. "Let me ask you something," Jasmine said, her voice quieter than before, the kind of quiet that asks you to lean in, the kind that doesn't just fill a room, it reshapes it. "If I sit here," she continued, "and explain why certain systems have pushed people to the margins, and your first instinct is to say I'm playing the victim, what does that say about how you listen?" It wasn't defensive. It wasn't defiant. It was diagnostic. The crowd didn't move. No one laughed. No one coughed. Even Maher didn't try to cut in. "I'm not oppressed because someone disagrees with me," she said. "I'm pointing out a pattern, and the moment I name that pattern, suddenly the conversation shifts, not to whether it's true, but to whether I'm being too sensitive." She looked at Maher again, not to confront, but to clarify. "That's not debate. That's deflection." Maher reached for his water, hand just a little too fast. His rhythm, usually razor sharp, was off by a beat, just enough for the room to notice. Jasmine stayed composed. "You say leadership means not playing the victim," she said, "but I say real leadership means being honest about what people have been surviving and why they're still having to explain it." She paused just for a second, especially when they look like me. That was the moment, not a mic drop, not a takedown, a mirror. And Maher, who had built a career on saying the uncomfortable thing, suddenly looked uncomfortable with the truth when it wasn't his. The crowd didn't clap, not yet. It was too soon. They were still absorbing it, not because it was aggressive, but because it was undeniable. And Jasmine, still calm, still upright, still razor sharp, sat in the stillness like it was her home. Because it was. Bill Maher tried to pivot. He shifted in his chair, half laughed, and waved a hand like he could clear the air with a gesture. "All right," he said, voice forced light, "so let's keep it civil. We don't have to make everything about oppression. This is just a conversation." But it was too late for that, because once a room feels truth, it can't be unfelt. Jasmine turned toward him, calm and unsmiling. Her eyes didn't narrow. Her voice didn't rise. She didn't lean in, didn't posture, didn't clench a fist or sharpen her tone. Instead, she stayed still, measured, grounded. "I am being civil," she said, the words smooth, deliberate. "I'm just not being small." The silence that followed didn't feel empty. It felt earned. A woman in the third row gasped, barely audible, but real. Someone in the back murmured, like they'd just heard something sacred. There was no cue for applause, no punchline, just the echo of a boundary being drawn in real time, not out of anger, out of clarity. Maher blinked, his mouth opened, then closed. He reached for his water again. His fingers fumbled slightly at the cap. The cue cards in front of him were suddenly useless. They couldn't rewrite what had just happened, because Jasmine hadn't attacked. She had corrected, and she'd done it without even standing up. The applause came slow. One clap, then two, then a wave. Not performative, not polite. It wasn't about choosing sides. It was about recognition. They weren't cheering for a zinger. They were responding to a truth they hadn't realized they were waiting to hear. Maher tried to recover. He fumbled for another question, but the room had shifted. The spotlight wasn't his anymore. Not really, not fully. It had moved, not louder, but lower, towards something deeper. Jasmine adjusted her blazer, sat back. She wasn't finished, but she didn't need to say more, because the line had landed, and the country was about to hear it. The clip hit Twitter before the credits even finished rolling. 14 seconds. That's all it took. No yelling, no finger pointing, just Jasmine Crockett sitting calmly across from Bill Maher and saying, "I'm not being small." By midnight, it was everywhere. On TikTok, it was clipped under dramatic music, text floating across the screen. "This is how you hold power without raising your voice." On Instagram, it was turned into a reel with subtitles and a single-word caption, "Respect." By morning, the hashtags had taken over. "I'm not being small. Crockett vs. Maher. Say it again." Comment threads were a collage of shock, admiration, and quiet realization. People weren't just celebrating the moment, they were unpacking it. Office workers sent it to group chats. Teachers played it before homeroom. Even people who didn't watch the show knew what had happened. The thing that went viral wasn't rage, it was restraint. Maher began trending, but not for his wit, not for a viral one-liner. He was trending because people had watched him try to provoke and fail. Bill Maher tried to bait her, and she gave him a mirror instead, one user wrote. "She didn't clap back," another added. "She made him sit in it." Major outlets picked it up. The Daily Beast, The Atlantic, BuzzFeed News. Think pieces went live before sunrise. Why tone policing still happens on live TV. The power of political stillness. The moment, Jasmine Crockett redefined the table. But what struck most people wasn't what was said. It was how it was said. No interruptions, no escalation. Just a line so clear, so quiet, it echoed louder than any mic drop. And Maher, who had built a brand on controlling conversations, suddenly found himself overheard, not heard. A bystander in a moment that didn't belong to him. By noon, the clip had passed 5 million views. By nightfall, it was being used in college lectures, workplace trainings, and group chats between mothers and daughters. And still, Jasmine said nothing more. She didn't post, didn't tweet, because she didn't need to. The truth was, doing the talking now, it didn't take long for the spin to start. By the next morning, conservative media had already recut the clip, tightening Jasmine's calm, measured answer into something clipped and decontextualized. Crockett lashes out on Maher. Emotional meltdown on live TV. Another angry progressive moment. It didn't matter that her voice never rose. It didn't matter that she hadn't interrupted, hadn't postured, hadn't even moved more than a few inches in her chair. The narrative was already being drafted by the same playbook she had exposed, one that mistook correction for chaos and painted boundaries as outbursts. A few headlines even used the phrase on-air tantrum. It was predictable, and it was tired. But Jasmine didn't respond. No tweets, no quote reposts, no late-night clarifications with 3-swipe Instagram captions. She let them talk. Because while they were writing spin, she was writing policy. Her staff released a quiet but firm statement the next day, 4 paragraphs long, centered entirely on housing legislation she was co-sponsoring. No mention of Maher, no acknowledgement of the clip, just the work. She gave a radio interview in Houston that same afternoon. The host asked her gently if she wanted to address the moment. Jasmine smiled. "I'm more interested in the moments that come after," she said. And that was it. She shifted the conversation without fighting for the mic. Some critics called it a missed opportunity. Others said she should have seized the momentum. But they misunderstood. Jasmine wasn't trying to go viral. She was trying to govern with dignity, in a world that keeps asking her to prove she belongs in the room every time she opens her mouth. And for those who knew how rare that kind of discipline was, her silence didn't feel like absence. It felt like power, choosing when to speak, and how. A week passed. The news cycle spun forward. Another scandal, another soundbite, another half-hearted apology from someone with too much airtime. But Jasmine's clip didn't vanish. It floated, quietly, persistently. In a classroom in Atlanta, a high school English teacher played the moment for her students, just the 14 seconds. Then she asked them to write about a time they were told to shrink. In a break room in Phoenix, 2 nurses watched it during lunch. One of them whispered, "I've said that in my head 1,000 times. She just said it out loud. In Des Moines, a church group hosted a Wednesday night women's circle. They didn't study scripture that evening. They studied posture, tone, boundaries. One woman wrote in her journal, "I'm not being small, I'm being whole." The line traveled far, not because it was loud, because it was clear. It didn't become a meme, it became a mirror, a sentence that gave people back a piece of themselves, something they'd been asked to let go of in offices, in marriages, in public, in silence. And through it all, Jasmine didn't chase the next headline. She went back to work, town halls, policy meetings, school visits. When a local journalist asked her why she hadn't built on the buzz, she laughed. "Buzz fades," she said, "but people remember who made them feel seen." And that's what the line did. It made people feel seen. Jasmine never booked a victory lap, never snapped back on Twitter, never rehearsed a second zinger. The moment didn't need one. Because when she stood up, metaphorically, spiritually, strategically, and said, "I'm not being small," it wasn't just a defense. It was a blueprint. And in that final image, Jasmine walking off the set, no mic drop, no drama, no spotlight trailing her, there was no need for a final word. She already said it, with stillness, with truth, and with a power that didn't ask for permission to take its place. This story was brutal, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.